Hello, hello, hello. Hi, friends. Today is episode 123 of Stand Up with Pete Dominick. Joining me today, a professor of communications and global journalism at Morgan State University, Dr. Jason Johnson joins me, and former federal prosecutor Glenn Kirschner. I'm Pete Dominick. Time to stand up with me right now. Hello. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining me today. I'm happy to have you still in upstate New York at my parents' house and beautiful rural area where I grew up and had a very peaceful day with nature and my family, and things are going pretty good up here. Very happy to be here with them, and I hope that you are doing okay, hanging in there, knowing that you aren't alone. We're all experiencing some crazy shit. It seemed like a year ago this morning that the President of the United States attacked a 75-year-old man who had been pushed by police officers in Buffalo and fell and broke his head and had blood coming out of it, and still in the hospital, by the way, and dealing with tremendous pain. And New York Times had a great profile of this guy and his life, and how Trump falsely targeted him with crazy conspiracy theories that he was somehow Antifa. This 75-year-old guy was Antifa, and he was somehow interfering with the communications equipment of the police. I mean, just nutso stuff. And not surprising, because I spent an hour and a half on Tuesday talking to a Trump supporter who I'd had on the show before. And I've decided not to air. I taped it. I decided not to air it. It was too crazy. It was absolutely insane, the conversation I was having with this guy who kept talking about the deep state and pedophile rings and QAnon. And I'm now convinced that a frighteningly large percentage of people who support Trump are also just way out there in a completely different galaxy about conspiracy theories and stuff. I mean, shit that you might not have heard of if you haven't looked into this or have lost a loved one to these crazy theories, but just way out there stuff. Way, way out there. And he kept talking about pedophile rings and that he lived by his Catholic values. And I said to the guys, like, the Catholic Church, if any institution is running pedophile rings, it's the one that you are so dedicated to and giving your money to. Not the Democratic Party and the deep state. There's no pedophile rings in Congress. It's really disconcerting how far Donald Trump has led his sheep, his cult members, and I just can't believe and have such a challenging time trying to understand why someone would possibly support and believe in these crazy theories. So that's a thing I did today. I talked with this guy, and I just can't post it, guys. I just can't. It's too nuts. We were talking over each other, and it's just not worth it, but it certainly was enlightening. If anybody honestly wants to hear it, maybe I'll just send it to you. I don't think you want to hear it. It's nuts. So it was crazy because of that today. And it was also crazy what has gone on in the Georgia primaries, and I highly recommend that you follow someone like Ari Berman, who's a reporter covering voting and voting rights for years. And I talk about it in my conversation coming up with Jason Johnson here. But what has happened today in Georgia is really frightening because of how difficult it was for black folks to vote in their precincts, and the polls were difficult to access, and there were all kinds of technical issues. And so I highly recommend that you look into that and try to understand what happened in Georgia Tuesday rather, and learn about it, because that is going to be part of the game plan for what happens in November. It's an absolute disaster. The headline at Vanity Fair: Georgia's primary disaster does not bode well for 2020. Washington Post: Georgia debacle shows we're heading toward an election disaster in November. Mother Jones: how the coronavirus handed the GOP. No, okay, that one has nothing to do with it. So anyway, just highly recommend that you look into that. Talk to your friends in Georgia. Read Ari Berman. Listen to my conversation coming up with Dr. Jason Johnson about just that. Okay, so there's those things, and I think that's all I wanted to mention. Let's get to my first conversation right now. Oh, you know what? I did want to read this from Jim in Michigan. And I've been getting a lot of amazing feedback from listeners lately. And I like to share from time to time. So, you're not alone in this audience listening to this podcast every day. But Jim reached out and said, subject, your show and guests. While working in my flower garden today, I listened to our show. I always referred to it as that. I should get back to that, our show. And when it was over, I told my wife, Terry, how the show has helped me evolve and has changed my feelings on several subjects. I remember Tim Wise's first appearance. I really didn't like him at all. I think it had something to do with the I'm misfiring. I don't know. But the second time, he had a new book, and I don't remember the title, but I liked him and his ideas even more. Flash forward now to 2020, and I essentially agree with almost everything he says. I guess you can teach an old dog new tricks after all. The same thing happened with gay marriage, Pete. You and I actually had an on-air debate about it. My sister was involved with a woman, and I strongly disagreed with the idea that they could be married. Today, I've actually performed a wedding ceremony for two men. I know that the past 6 months have been a mother rucker for you, Pete, and I feel for you. But after hearing Tim today and realizing how much you've helped to open my eyes and my heart, I'm sure I'm not the only one, and I wanted to say that you do good work and you help people learn about our world. Jim. Well, Jim, that just about is the greatest email that anybody could write, and I really appreciate that. And I appreciate your support and everybody else who, especially those of you that are paying for subscriptions, please consider signing up to be a paid subscriber. And you can go to patreon.com or just look for the paid subscription link in the show notes. And finally, from Derek, who writes in a subject, defund the police. Pete, day late on this one, but defund the police is the slogan. One, because it encompasses all the reforms that John Oliver described on a show last week tonight, but also, and more importantly, two, it's the only thing legislatures can do, especially in the face of the massive adamantium opposition of police unions. Cut funding to get them to the table as well. Otherwise, any law is subject to weak administrative officials like, say, Bill de Blasio to enforce. And look how quickly he folded to the NYPD. This isn't something that activists just pulled out of the air in a Twitter thread. There are years of thinking behind it. It's just the time we're going to have the debate right now. Peace and love, Derek. Thanks, Derek. And thanks, everybody else, for listening and for your emails and your suggestions and your ideas and your compliments and your criticisms. Bring it all. And now let's get to my conversation with my first guest today, Dr. Jason Johnson. All right, I've got Dr. Jason Johnson back with me now, and very excited to have you. Thank you for joining me today, pal.
I am always glad to be here, Pete. I am prepared to talk about the shenanigans that are affecting our country right now.
Well, I wasn't going to talk about that. I wanted to talk about gluten-free diets with you today.
That was my plan. I think we've got a good sponsor with like gluten-free diets or jujubes or something like that.
All right. So first of all, we've got to tell people, hopefully by the time this podcast lands, which is tomorrow morning at 4 a.m., more people will know about what is happening in Georgia today as far as voting goes, because this has got to be a top story, as you tweeted earlier, and I hope it will be. I hope it builds momentum. What is happening in Georgia?
Grand theft election is happening in Georgia. The Georgia primaries was delayed. It was delayed by the governor. But what we've seen from Brian Kemp, from him being Secretary of State and stealing the election from Stacey Abrams in 2018 to now, is the kind of naked, consistent disenfranchisement that all of us should be alarmed about. It isn't just that Brian Kemp delayed the primary. Brian Kemp also canceled an election for a vacant state Supreme Court seat and just filled it himself. Now what we have happening on the ground, and I think this is important to remember, who is running in the Senate seats that are available, potentially 2 Senate seats in Georgia are up. That is less important than the fact that the process itself has been completely corrupted and abused. That you have, as of 11 o'clock in the morning, you have voting machines and primarily Democratic strongholds that don't work. There were tweets and videos by poll workers saying, look, this polling place usually has 12 people. Today it only has 4. We were only given 20 provisional ballots. People being told to stand outside in the heat during a pandemic that has a disproportionate effect on Black and brown people, and they're still being forced to vote in person And then they're being told that the machines that they're supposed to be able to vote on, which have already been corrupted, which are extremely problematic because they don't have a paper trail, are down and broken. This is not just a canary in a coal mine. This is what we're going to see in 2020 in the presidential election. This is what we're going to see in Georgia. This is what we're going to see in Florida. This is what we might see in Arizona. This is what we might see in Ohio. The Democratic Party, as an institution, as a staff label and an organization, needs to be prepared for this, because whatever ends up happening in Georgia, assuming that there's no lawsuits that end up putting the governor or the secretary of state in jail, that will be seen as a sign for what other Republican governors can do heading into the election for the president.
The current governor of Georgia, did you mention this, is Brian Kemp. He was the last secretary of state, and the job of secretary of state in every state is not like the secretary of state in the federal government, but is to see to look after one of the top priorities, elections. That's what the Secretary of State does. So Brian Kemp looked after the election that he actually cheated to beat Stacey Abrams in. And the conflict of interest was so overt. And he didn't, if my recollection serves itself, recuse himself from the shenanigans there. Now he is the governor. They're having an election right now, the primary in Georgia. And as you said, they're having all kinds of problems in the districts where likely Democrats, specifically black folks, live and vote. Do I have it right?
Yeah, that's it.
And you're saying this is by design, sir.
It is completely by design. Look, I go back to 2018. I covered a lot of the 2018 race. I'm paying attention covering Georgia now. If you go back to 2018, this was, I thought, one of the most hilarious and egregious examples of intentional neglect. There was a polling place, I think it was in Dinwiddie, Georgia? It wasn't Duluth, but there was a polling place in one of the Atlanta suburbs. And they went in to start the voting in the morning, and they didn't have power cords for the voting machines. How do you run out of power cords in a metro area that is like the headquarters of Home Depot? Right? Like that doesn't happen by accident. That is intentional. Or the fact that in Georgia, the data from 2014 and 2018 elections was supposed to be kept on a server at Kennesaw State University, and somehow that server got wiped. And yes, you can't just wipe a server at a university because you walk by it with a magnet. That has to be done. There have been documentaries. The Great Hack. There are tons of documentaries out there that specifically focus on what has happened in Georgia and the level of voter fraud and corruption and disenfranchisement that's happening there. And I don't tell people this so that they can just wring their fists. And I know that when people hear this, they're like, well, what can I do? What can I do? Sure. Well, the first thing you can do is make sure that you prepare yourself by not only registering to vote, but honestly, under this environment, you need to check your voter registration the way you check your credit score. Like every 30 days, just go to make sure you're still registered, because the voter purges, which have also been made popular by Republicans, where every couple of months they'll just start wiping names out of the voter rolls under the guise of, well, your name doesn't match this, or you didn't vote in the last election. And sometimes it's just a mistake. So you need to check your voter registration the way you check your credit score, and then get yourself an early absentee ballot, because we know that if this is being done in a primary, that the goal is going to be come November, with the pandemic still going on and possibly cold weather, that there will be every attempt in the world to make in-person voting almost impossible.
Boy, that sounds like too much. It just sounds like too much work to have to go through to make sure that you can vote and that your vote will be counted. And that's by design, because when you create work, I mean, bottom line is, if people have to wait in lines for a long time, they might walk away. And we have amazing stories of people standing there all day, no matter what they try, especially black folks who have been fighting for equal rights still to this day, saying you're not going to take my rights away. But at some point, you have to go home and take care of your kids. You have to go back to your job. I mean, it is by design. Not everybody can stand and wait to cast a vote all day long. And it's always impressive when people do, because it is only one vote. But how much of what Georgia is able to do and what other states might be able to do you think, Jason, has to do with the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act by the Supreme Court?
It's completely, because many of those states, Texas, Georgia, North Carolina, they were under the Voting Rights Act. They could not make substantial changes to voting without getting approval from the Department of Justice. So, if you were Georgia, you were Alabama, and you were Mississippi, and you wanted to say, all right, look, we want to move this polling station. We have 5 polling stations in this district. You know what? Everybody is moving to the suburbs. We think we should lower it to maybe 3 instead of 5. They used to have to get approval from the Department of Justice to do that. Now they don't. So if they want to change,
that is the fucking point right there.
Yes.
That is why civil rights folks fought for the right to vote, for equal access to the polls, so that they couldn't put obstacles in the way. As soon as the Supreme Court voted to gut the Voting Rights Act, they changed the rules, and now they have the ability to do what they're doing, as you just explained. That's why I wanted to jump in there. It's this action leads to this action and leads to voter suppression, and it's basically poll taxes, making it hard for black people to vote in America in 2020.
Yep. It's not by accident. It is not an oversight. It is intentional. We have just a surfeit of evidence of emails, people being caught at fundraisers saying that this is their goal. Their goal is to limit and suppress the African-American vote. Their goal is to make the process seem so frustrating that people don't want to participate. And
if Georgia gets away with it today, then they will certainly try to do it in November, as well as other states' primaries. If they get away with it, if they aren't held responsible. And so I'm not sure, we're seeing people in the streets, and mostly focused, people think, on police, brutality and law enforcement. But I like to think that it's all of systemic racism. It's this too. It's most people are talking about defund the police, or no justice, no peace, and all of that. But this is an integral part of what we refer to as systemic racism, making it harder for black people to have opportunity for everything, education, employment, and to vote. I mean, isn't this why, or shouldn't this be part of the protest movement right now?
It is. And I think what's interesting, Pete,
if it is, I feel like it gets lost in the signs and what people are saying, and in the streets today. But that's okay. I mean, no protest isn't run by a PR company like the Tea Party was.
Well, but here's what's funny: protests aren't run by PR companies, but the way protest messages are affected and twisted and moved, and the language involved, that is run by PR companies
that's a great point.
With media organizations and with parties, right? So that's why, and for example, we're seeing this transformation, like in 2 simple steps, right? How many years? Colin Kaepernick has been out of football for 4 years. The guy said, look, I'm taking a knee to protest police brutality. And yet ESPN and Fox and plenty of commentators on television continue to allow people to say on television, he's protesting the flag, even though the guy said that's not what I'm doing. But that message was repeated over and over and over again. And they allowed people to say that on the air. They allowed analysts and anchors to say that on the air, to suggest that they didn't know what he was saying when what he was saying was explicit. You have the same thing happening now with these protests. That's why you can have people say, well, I don't know what they're talking about. They're saying we want police to have to behave with humanity towards the communities that they police. They are saying we want these officers to be held accountable. They are saying we want reform in the criminal justice system, where Ahmaud Arbery can be killed by 2 guys in broad daylight, one of whom is a former cop, and they don't get brought in until 2.5 months later, and 3 different local attorneys, district attorneys, recuse themselves from the cases because there's a revolving door between white nationalist vigilantes and the criminal justice system in parts of Georgia. That is what people are protesting about. And so to the degree that any press coverage suggests that the message is muddled, suggests that we're not clear what's going on, and you see it happening now with defund versus abolish the police, that is an intentional effort to mute the passions and the legitimate rebellion going on, and to make it seem like it's unfocused and unclear.
So let's talk about that, because you've been tweeting about that. And when we're talking about language and the language of protest in this case, you've been tweeting about the 2 phrases, or hashtags even, they become defund the police and abolish the police. And I know you're working on a piece for this. Where will you be? Where will you be posting it? And I hope that you can talk about it with me right now, the difference here.
Yeah. So I will be, that'll be on the Grio later on this week. And I think this is important. Now, I'm not going to say where I fall on this, just yet. That'll be in the piece. But what I want to share with the public is this, because what we just saw on Sunday was the Minneapolis, city council saying, all right, that's it. We're abolishing the police department. And abolishing the police department means we're no longer going to have a police department. We're going to replace it with something else that does a similar job in a better way. So abolishment is, I am done with this thing. Defunding the police is, we're going to take the money that we spend on the police department and use it in other city services that, quite frankly, may be in more need of this funding, and that, if properly funded, might diminish the need for the police anyway. So those are two different things. Now, there are some people who are going to argue that defunding the police is on a spectrum of abolishing the police. And maybe that's true. But as of right now, they are still two distinct ideas. And I think the public needs to really, really start thinking about what this means. We need to be more creative in our imaginations. And this idea that, well, if we defund the police, then how are the cops going to be able to work? Look, I know this sounds glib, but my guess is if you took a significant chunk of the police budget and you put that, into education so that every teacher in the school district only had to teach 10 or 12 kids instead of 35, I bet you wouldn't need as many cops. I suspect if you took the funding that goes into anti-drug intervention and put that into drug prevention and rehab programs, you probably wouldn't need as many police. So that's the value of sort of defunding argument. Now, the abolishment argument is something else entirely, because they're saying, look, we got to get rid of this from the roots, and we need to replace it with something else that provides security and also protects the community. And I'll say this quickly. We have to be creative. Slavery existed in this country for 400 years. There was no part of our economy, military, defense, or culture that was not affected by slavery. There was nobody alive during the abolition movement who had a relative who was alive before slavery. People didn't even know what an America without slavery would look like, but it still got done. And we haven't had policing nearly as long as we've had slavery. So we can't say that that idea is beyond the pale of what Americans can accomplish.
Well, you defund the police, abolish the police. You're talking only about specifically law enforcement there. And we can go all the way as far as talking about reparations. But that word brings up all kinds of crazy ideas for different people. But what I look at right now, just the idea of investing into predominantly black communities and investing in opportunities for black folks is what should be done. And we can talk about how that can creatively and effectively be done, and more importantly, where it has been done for really a long, long time. But what I see right now is black businesses not even be able to get a loan that was designed because of the pandemic. What I see is even government, the federal government, is handing out money right now to businesses, and black businesses are not getting it. We could talk about why. But I feel like we're a long way from recreating society and institutions, including local law enforcement, if black businesses can't even get the money that is being handed out to everybody.
Yeah, so I actually had a conversation this morning with Tara Dowdell, who used to be at the Port Authority in New Jersey. She's now a consultant, and she's been tweeting. You can look up her online, Tara Dowdell. She's been tweeting about block grants that are being offered to minority-owned businesses right now by the state of New Jersey to help people survive this business. And mind you, these are grants, not loans. Like, you can take this money and invest it in your business, keep your employees working, keep your health care. Here's the catch, and I wanted to make sure I gave her that shout out. Yes, we've had all these businesses that aren't getting their checks from the government. They're not being given the stimulus. They're not being given the support. It's been difficult for them to stay open and stay functional. We've seen sort of piecemeal attempts. I think it's either Grubhub or Uber Eats has said that basically they're gonna waive. I saw this tweet yesterday. They're gonna waive their fee for black-owned restaurants for the remainder of the year. Right? Waive their fee for it's either Grubhub or Uber Eats. I don't know which one is doing it. But here's the thing: investment alone is not enough. Because simply putting more money into the African-American community without the empowerment, both politically and policy-wise, to protect that money and protect those resources, it ends up not being all that helpful.
And without that, and without the empowerment, without access to health insurance, without access to, decent schools, all of these concepts rest upon another, which is, on one another, which is why you have to restructure the whole damn thing so that we don't have the poverty that leads to the crime that leads to, by the way, crime by design, things like the drug war and mass incarceration, and what I've been talking to with public defenders about the injustice and access to representation. I mean, it all works together by design to become what we are referring to as systemic racism. So you can't just fix one part, or else if you fix one part, people are like, see, we fixed it. We did what you said. And there's still whatever, like that's what I'm hearing.
And here's the thing. The problem that I think everybody needs to understand is that, institutional racism, which allows systematic racism to continue, it can't be defeated. It's not Jenga. You can't take out one piece and then suddenly the whole thing collapses.
That's a better way of saying what, I was trying to model through.
It doesn't work that way. It's not going to fall apart that way because all of these institutions are built in a way to survive protests. They're built in a way to survive. It's like a building in LA. It's built to survive an earthquake. So you're going to have to knock things down in order to make a difference. What's going to happen going forward when we look at Ahmaud Arbery, when we look at what's happening in Minneapolis, when we look at what happened with Breonna Taylor? I point out, for example, if you look at what's happening right now in Louisville, the officers that shot Breonna Taylor are still getting paychecks. They haven't been arrested at all. Even though we've discovered that three of the officers, I think two out of the four officers who were involved in the shooting, they turned off their body cameras, right? And so I think what everybody has to understand is that we've made attempts over the years, or right-minded people who care about humanity and history and the functional nature of our democracy. They've tried over the years to make technical changes. All right, well, let's add body cameras, or let's tell them not to use this chokehold, and let's use, non-lethal weapons. Well, what has that done? That leads to a police car driving through a crowd of people in the Barclay Center in gentrifying Brooklyn and shooting everybody with mace. That's still, this is Brooklyn in broad daylight. That didn't change the fact that we have video of police officers and state troopers slashing tires of journalists and activists in Minneapolis.
What's that about, by the way? Has anybody been able to uncover? That was clearly an order given, right?
Yeah. Yes.
That was a policy. Why? I mean, who gave that order, and how is it legal, and how do they justify stabbing, flattening tires?
Well, my guess is the justification is to prevent people from fleeing the scene. So if we're trying to round everybody up and arrest everybody, we don't want them to be able to leave. Now, that is an entirely unnecessary, egregious, and borderline state terrorist level of responding. You don't have to damage property. And by the way, they were popping the tires of journalists.
Yeah. Yeah, so, it was.
Yeah, this is just sort of state-sponsored terrorism. And that's what I'm saying about, people have to recognize that what we're experiencing right now is not something that is simply a couple of bad apples. You got to go all the way up to the tree, the top of the tree and the bottom of the roots. Because for anyone to think that was an okay order, you're just jacking up somebody's car. I mean, who told you that was cool? Who told you
crazy
that
thing?
Sense?
It's by the way, a video of cops doing any of these terrible things is so bad for the cops, their own PR department. It's so egregious. All right, Dr. Jason Johnson, everybody, follow him right now on Twitter. Read everything he's writing. Watch we didn't get to talk to it, but the great piece you did for Vox, which has gone viral, almost 1 million views on that. I always appreciate you joining me in conversation. Thanks for your time today, pal.
Anytime, Pete. Stay safe.
You too. All right. I love that guy. Love talking to Jason Johnson. Always learn a lot. And he's just so smart and funny and thoughtful and compassionate. And it's a privilege having a discussion with him. Always great when he joins the show. Okay. Did I mention earlier? I don't think I did. No, that Don Bongino? He's like one of the most popular conservative talkers and has one of the most popular podcasts and over 1 million followers on Twitter, and he's like a big Fox News guy. I think that's what made him famous, former Secret Service, whatever. Anyway, he was going after Shannon Watts. I don't know how it started, but I just jumped in between them and called him names. And then he retweeted me a couple times. He's got a massive army of Trumpers and just complete nut jobs. And so they went after me in my mentions on Twitter for a couple of hours last night, and it was fascinating to see the things that they were saying, and I highly recommend you look at the mentions, but a lot of mentions of dicks and cocks. I mean, just a real obsession with these gun people. They're the gun guys with dicks. They go right for it and insinuate that you are obsessed with dicks and want to suck dicks and are a lib. And it was just a real social experiment with his followers coming after me. And if you want to be entertained for a little while, just go read the mentions from my tweets last night between that guy and I. Really wild time. I enjoyed it, though. It was entertaining. And I challenged him to a fight to raise money for charity. So check it out. I'm sure it'll go great. All right. Now I want to get to my second guest of tonight's show. He's a former federal prosecutor who I met while we were on the same panels at MSNBC, and he's fantastic. He's got his own YouTube channel now that I highly recommend you go and find Glenn Kirschner on YouTube. Just look his name up, 2 N's, KIRSCHNER. Massive following on Twitter at Glenn Kirschner 2, and you should definitely follow him there as well. Love talking to this guy. He went to his first protest ever in Washington, D.C. last Saturday at that big protest. And we talked about that. We talked about Trump administration and Bill Barr, who he calls enemy of the people, the real enemy of the people. Fantastic. Another great conversation with one of your new favorites here on the podcast, Glenn Kirschner, right now. All right, I have one of your all-time favorite guests joining me right now, Glenn Kirschner, on the phone because I am upstate at my parents' house. Speaking of which, my dad is a huge Glenn Kirschner fan. I like whenever that guy's on the show, is what he just told me.
Well, you tell your dad I appreciate that, Pete.
So lots to talk with you about. First of all, you attended the big protest this past Saturday in D.C., right?
I did.
And you did obviously post a lot of social media from there, and people should watch. But what was your overall impression of being there? Have you ever been to an event like that?
You know what, Pete? I'm almost 60 years old. I've never once been to a protest. As a former 30-year career prosecutor, protesting was not necessarily my thing.
Yeah.
But I'll be damned if I was going to miss this one, because I've also seen police abuses, particularly of our African-American brothers and sisters, for too damn long. So I went down there. I stood on Black Lives Matter Plaza. I shed a tear. I chanted with all of the fellow protesters for justice and fairness and equity. And it was moving. It was, I didn't count up the protesters, but it was probably far larger than Trump's inauguration crowd. But, you know, it was young, old, Black, white, Hispanic. I mean, people of all stripes, all ethnicities, all ages. Everywhere there were tables set up with folk, I'm not talking vendors, just real people giving out whatever the crowd needed. You need free water, you need free snacks, you need to cool off, you need a mask, you need whatever. It was a community, it was stirring, it was inspirational, and the whole thing was frankly beautiful. And I think now is the moment in time that we can wrestle police misconduct to the ground and actually affect change.
How is your evolution. I talk a lot about my evolution, my education, my awakening, if you will, about, just diversity and the history of this country, discrimination, and how I learned to understand systemic racism. You grew up in New Jersey, and then you, of course, were in the military and worked for the federal government as a prosecutor. Have you had an evolution on understanding the struggle for minorities in this country and understanding discrimination, and then even understanding systemic racism? Have you had an evolution on that in your life?
I have. And so I was lucky to have a pop who, God rest his soul, was a high school football coach in New Jersey, sometimes out of work. He was a troublemaker himself. But, among other places he coached at Neptune High School, which was a predominantly African-American high school. And I would go to see him during practice, and I would stand on the sidelines during the games. And I was the little white kid who was sort of, I was the coach's son, but when I'd hang out in the locker room, I felt like the team mascot for a predominantly African-American football team.
That's cool.
I always felt comfortable in the African-American community as much as the white community. Of course, I then joined the Army, and the Army is one of those diverse places where if any institution is kind of a meritocracy and kind of colorblind, it's the Army, at least to a greater degree than like the private sector or the business community, where, I am concerned about what soldier is going to have my back in a foxhole. And I don't care if that soldier is black, white, Hispanic, Asian. It doesn't matter, because we are one cohesive unit. Now, I don't want to give the misimpression. I was not an infantryman. I was an Army JAG, but you felt that same sense of unity and mission, and color, at least to me, didn't really factor into your military service. Then when I transitioned to the U.S. Attorney's Office, Pete, I spent 22 of my 30 years as a prosecutor handling murder cases. So yes, the defendants I prosecuted were largely African-American, but guess what? So were the victims and the victim's family, and many of my homicide detectives, many of the judges who presided over the murder cases were African-American, and most of the jurors were African-American. So again, it was largely a colorblind practice in my experience, but I saw police abuses. I saw police abuses of African-American citizens. So I definitely became more sensitized to that over time, the older I got. Now, mind you, my 30 years, my partners were law enforcement, whether it was the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Department, MPD, or, it was the FBI, DEA, ATF, Park Police, Capitol Police, Secret Service, Uniform Division, Amtrak Police, Postal Police, Metro Police, Military Police when I was a JAG. So did I have important relationships with police officers all day long? However, I always held them to a higher standard. And God forbid I caught you as a police officer doing something wrong. And Pete, I caught police officers at times doing something wrong. I'm going to jump down on you with both feet. I may have to dismiss a murder case as a remedy for police misconduct. And I did that. I may have to prosecute homicide detectives who tried to get a witness to lie and identify somebody that they couldn't legitimately identify because the homicide detectives didn't want them to, quote, F up my 100% closure rate. Now, I talk about those abuses, Pete, not because they were the norm. They weren't. They were an aberration, but they happened. And when they happened, and the same is true of excessive force, you have to jump down on it with both feet, not just one foot. You have to stamp it out. And that's something we have been unwilling to do as a society, hopefully until now.
Is there any specific case that, what it sounds like you're saying is that when, police would bring a homicide suspect to you, if they arrested him or did something that was unlawful or illegal to gather evidence, you couldn't prosecute him because then his defense would say they gathered this evidence illegally or something like that. I can't even paint a hypothetical scenario, but is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it was my job. So, for example, one of the things the homicide detectives do is, when a body drops, we've got a homicide investigation. They investigate at light speed. The first 48 hours really are the most crucial. And then if they got enough evidence that they believed made a probable cause showing with respect to the identity of the killer, they would bring that warrant to me. And then it was my job to review it, to go through the evidence, to have a hard talk with the police officers. If it was a case I was assigning to myself specifically, I would want to meet with maybe the most important eyewitness promptly to get that person in the grand jury and lock in their testimony. But I had a decision to make. Was there enough evidence to support a probable cause finding? If there was, I signed that warrant, and the homicide detective sprinted over to a judge to have a warrant issued for the suspect's arrest. If I didn't believe there was enough evidence to make a probable cause finding, then I refused to sign the warrant. I worked with the detectives to say, okay, guys, gals, here's what we need to get this up to probable cause snuff as quickly as humanly possible, so a killer is not hanging out in our community, potentially, in a position to hurt other citizens. And then they would go out and they would try to get whatever additional evidence they needed. But I had to review everything they had to make sure that the evidence that they acquired was lawful, whether it was an interview of a witness or a search of a suspect's car or home or electronic devices. It had to be acquired lawfully, or I was not able to include that evidence in the probable cause calculus. So, yeah, I had challenging decisions to make all along the way to make sure that the evidence that was collected honestly, legally, constitutionally, and therefore could be used in court in a prosecution.
So you've also, on your YouTube channel, you have a great, one of your most recent videos, and everybody should subscribe to Glenn on YouTube, where he's posting videos almost every day, and follow him on Twitter at Glenn Kirschner 2, where he's got a massive following and tremendous influence that he wields there. That you have been calling for law enforcement reforms in terms of policing. Tell me a little bit about what you think needs to change.
Yeah, and I think the time is right, Pete, because, the one thing that I have been, I'm going to say shocked by, is the fact that for the last 3.5 years, we, the people, have been abused in every way imaginable by Trump and his criminal cronies, the Trump administration. And yet none of it has driven us to the streets in massive numbers to protest against those abuses that have been perpetrated against us, we, the people. Same holds true with COVID. COVID broke, and we see the Trump administration either negligently or intentionally refusing to protect us in a common sense way. Instead, they're trying to grift and profit off of the Byzantine supply chain of protective equipment, right? And even that didn't drive us out into the streets. But what's driven us out into the streets? That 9-minute videotape of what those 4 police officers did when they murdered George Floyd. That drove us into the streets in now a 12-day sustained nationwide protest, a worldwide protest. And if all of those other abuses weren't important enough to get us out, this got us out. And what a hopeful sign for what we find to be most egregious and most unacceptable and most in need of change, but what we saw them do to one of our African-American brothers. So I am optimistic that the time for change is now. The political will for change is now. And some of the common sense police reforms that I think would go a long way to remedying this so we don't have another George Floyd tomorrow include sort of a 3-point plan. One is extreme vetting during the hiring process, and I'll talk about that in a minute. 2 is extreme training, and not just training, testing. And the training and testing of police officers has to go on at least monthly, not just when they're in the academy and then unleash them to the streets and then they'll do annual training 1 year down the road. If you train and test monthly so that proper force, not excessive force, becomes like muscle memory to officers, that will go a long way to ensuring that when they're out in the street, they're going to remember that training and testing. And then the 3rd is extreme accountability. 1 strike and you're out. 1 strike, 1 incidence of excessive force against the citizen, and you're out. You're out of this game. you're off of this law enforcement team, and a national registry, National Accountability Registry for Cops, NARC, cute, right? NARC. There will be a national registry, so you will not be permitted to join any other police force. That's the 3-point plan. But let me hit point one, which is extreme vetting during the hiring practice.
Yeah.
So, and this is so doable, Pete. It's so doable. Think about this. We vote for who we want to represent us in Washington. We vote for who our governor should be, who our mayor should be, who should be on our local city council, right? Those people will have pretty consequential impact over our day-to-day lives, right? They're going to enact laws that we have to live by. They're going to either raise or decrease our taxes. They're going to decide how our tax dollars should be spent. But think about this. The people with the most direct day-to-day influence over our lives are the police. Because you know what? My congressman or my mayor or my city council member can't pull me over if I'm speeding. And yes, I do speed. But a cop can pull me over, can order me out of the car, can order me on the ground, can put handcuffs on me. They can do all of those things. So why in the world shouldn't we, the people, have a say over who gets hired for that most consequential position in our society when it comes to our own personal freedoms? We can have citizen committees that participate actively in the hiring and vetting of police officers so that we make sure, not just the police hierarchy makes sure, but the citizens make sure that somebody who desperately wants to be a police officer, who wants to put that badge on their chest and that gun on their hip and order me out of my car, are in it for the right reasons. They're in it to protect and serve. They're not in it to be bullies or racists or be big men with a badge and a gun because they want to play cop and they want to control other
different
people's
incentives.
lives.
Yeah,
exactly. And so the people ought to have a say because it should be a contract. It should be a covenant between those who are doing the policing and those who are being policed. And only if the citizens are directly involved in the hiring and vetting, in the training, and in the accountability piece, you're never going to have that full partnership, that full contract, that full covenant. But all of these things are doable. They can be done. And I think this is the moment in time to do them.
All right, I want to change gears with you and talk about what we're seeing playing out with today's election in Georgia. I don't know if you've been following that. I talked with Jason Johnson about that today, but there's a lot of really important folks covering it. But there is a clear attempt to suppress the vote in black communities all over this country. And as a larger issue, I just wanted to talk to you about what your concerns are, Glenn, for the November elections and what you're seeing legally and what you think President Trump and the Trump administration may try to get away with in November based on what we've been seeing at these primaries and special elections.
Yeah, what won't they try to get away with, Pete? You know, we keep saying that, well, the president can't postpone the election lawfully. The president can't cancel the election lawfully. And yet everything that Trump has been doing, so much of it has been unlawful for the past 3.5 years. So, you know, the laws, unfortunately, are out the window because the point person on enforcing the federal laws, particularly against a criminal president and his corrupt administration, is the Attorney General of the United States. And because we have Bill Barr in place, and, you know, as pithy and succinct as I get, I tweeted out yesterday, Bill Barr is the enemy of the people.
Yeah, I saw that.
Period. And I don't like to say that. I worked for multiple attorney generals, I think starting with Janet Reno. And I don't like to say that, but it couldn't be more clear that Bill Barr is the enemy of the people. So I think they will pull out all the stops because I think, you know, when they see their 14 points down in Michigan, of all places, they know that they can't win fairly. Yes, things can change a few months down the road, but I don't suspect they will because Trump will continue to ratchet up his misconduct and his abuses. So they're going to try to cheat. They're going to try to cheat in every way possible. They did it in 2016. So we know they're going to exploit social media. They're going to welcome foreign assistance. But I am quite optimistic that, you know, if you look at the 2018 midterm blue wave as a guide, the Democrats picking up 41 seats in the House, we ain't seen nothing yet.
I hope you're right about that. But
I think I am, and I shouldn't make predictions because I'm often wrong. But when you look at what Trump has done since the 2018 midterms, he's ratcheted up the abuse and the misconduct and the crimes. And I don't believe, Pete, he is attracting a single new voter to his base, but I do firmly believe that he loses voters with each atrocity against the American people. And there are people who are like, look, I like his tax cuts. I like his deregulation because, F the environment, I can make a few extra bucks and I can pollute a little bit more in the process. But I even think he's losing some of those people with his daily atrocities. We're exhausted. We have this corruption fatigue, and I think he's going to get crushed come November. Cheat though he will try to do, I don't think his cheating around the edges will succeed.
When you say Bill Barr, the Attorney General, is the enemy of the people, I want you to back that up. And I wonder, because you've been tweeting and talking about this as well on your YouTube channel, which everybody needs to go subscribe to. What happened last week when the President of the United States walked over to a church and held up a Bible. But before he did that, apparently, because of permission from the Attorney General, he had protesters, peaceful protesters, it seemed, cleared with tear gas, which they're saying they didn't use, and rubber bullets, which I think they're also saying they didn't use. But I know a guy who got shot by rubber bullets that night at the White House, out in front of the White House. How is Bill Barr the enemy, and how much of what he did that night, the other night, will we forget about, or will we remember? Because that seemed like a campaign ad made for the president's critics. The president of the United States attacked the American public, peaceful protesters, so he could have a picture taken in front of a church holding a Bible, like not for any other reason. So what about Bill Barr's role in all of that? How is he the enemy of the people?
Yeah, it's hard to conceive of a more direct, unconstitutional act than attacking the American people who are doing exactly what the First Amendment provides. They are peaceably assembled, petitioning the government for a redress of their grievances. They're protesting. So when you think about the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, it's not really something that tells people what to do or tells the citizens what they can or should do. It tells the government what it can't do. And what the government can't do is abridge the people's right to free speech, abridge the right to a free press, abridge their right to practice whatever religion they want or no religion at all, the right to peaceably assemble, right? Those are a list of the government's don'ts. Thou shalt not. And that's what Bill Barr did. He ordered, and by all accounts, he's trying to weasel out of it now, but the best reporting tells us he ordered the way to be cleared of peaceful protesters so he and the president and the other sycophants could waltz across the street, stand in front of a church that Donald Trump has never attended, to hold up a book Donald Trump has never read for a photo op so he could make a campaign ad 30 minutes later. That is such a direct attack on the American people, an assault on the Constitution, that we can't forget it. We can't forgive it. Come January, it better be investigated. I was urging, if you were assaulted during that attack.
Hold on, you broke up for 1 second there. What did you say? If
I was urging people, if you were assaulted during that peaceful protest, go down to 500 Indiana Avenue, Northwest Washington, D.C. That is MPD, the Metropolitan Police Department headquarters, and file an assault complaint because you were assaulted. It's a criminal offense. It's an unconstitutional act by our federal government, specifically our Attorney General, and it needs to be dealt with. It doesn't need to be ignored because Trump has now tweeted out something even more outrageous today, so we forget about what our federal government did to us the day before.
So you also did some, I would call it journalism on your YouTube channel the other day, where you played Bill Barr's own words and the question being asked by one reporter. And I think this is really important and really interesting. And it's also elementary, the strategy that the Trump administration is taking. He's always got to paint black hats and white hats and lay blame and create an enemy. And in this case, throughout these protests, he has been referring to over and over, Trump, that is, Antifa, and that everybody is protesting is Antifa, or they're somehow against him and so on. And there's been no evidence of that. As a matter of fact, there's been evidence of other organizations infiltrating these protests, as you covered really well on your YouTube page, including playing the audio of all of it. And what do you make of that strategy and how effective it has been? And more importantly, Bill Barr picking up Trump's balls and running with them when it comes to this claim about Antifa, which is, it's not even an organization.
Yeah, it's. When I watched what Bill Barr did in that press conference, and frankly, I was concerned when I heard that there was going to be a press conference at noon. That was a couple of days ago that would include the Attorney General, the head of the FBI, the head of the DEA, the head of the ATF, the head of Homeland Security. I'm like, oh no, what's coming now? It didn't give me a good feeling. And what it was the ugliest and, if you paid attention, the most transparent propaganda and disinformation press conference that I've seen. And it was so upsetting. And that's why I put that YouTube video together, because when you realize that the public officials with their feet on the ground at the epicenter of the protests, Minneapolis, Minnesota, the governor, Tim Walz, and the public safety commissioner for the state of Minnesota, John Harrington, did a press conference a few days earlier and said, we are monitoring some social media platforms, and we see that white supremacist groups are expressly saying, let's get to Minnesota and take advantage of this protest. And the white supremacist groups can certainly do that. They can loot, they can burn, they can destroy, and they can make it seem like it's the minority community responsible for all of the damage and destruction, so they can further demonize the minority community. Now, I am not by a mile saying it's only been the alt-right, white supremacist groups that are responsible for the violence or the damage or the looting during these protests. That's not the point. The point is, we knew that was part of what was going on. Then you see Bill Barr stand up in a press conference and say the extreme left-wing groups like Antifa are doing the damage out there, and we have to put a stop to it.
Right.
And God bless Pierre Thomas, reporter for ABC News. The second question that was asked during that press conference, he said, Mr. Attorney General, do you think it's fair that you just stood up and told America that it's the left-wing groups, the extreme left-wing groups, it's Antifa that is responsible for the damage and the looting and the destruction, when just yesterday, the Department of Justice indicted 3 members of an alt-right group known as Boogaloo Boys, who were going to these protests and doing the damage and the destruction, and they were found in possession of Molotov cocktails. Sir, how can you tell the American people it is all about Antifa creating this? I mean, think about the disinformation and the propaganda involved. When the Attorney General knows that his own Department of Justice just the day before indicted radical right-wing groups, and yet he lied to the American people by saying it's all about Antifa.
I thought you said, and I thought I saw reporting as well, that and maybe you just said this and I missed it, Glenn, but that the FBI has reported that there was no evidence that Antifa was planning something, or that, I mean, again, that they are even an organized group of people. Did they not admit that? Did the FBI not put out a statement that they did not have and evidence of Antifa being a part of this? Because the president keeps yelling Antifa, and the FBI is like, I don't see it. And it reminds me of a number of other issues that have happened during this administration and other administrations where we don't have any intel that the president is saying. Weapons of mass destruction.
I jumped over that piece, and you're absolutely right, Pete. The FBI did put out a statement saying we have no intelligence that Antifa is responsible for the violence during the protest. The reason I jumped over that piece is because it's even more dramatic to me, to a former career prosecutor, that the Department of Justice had indicted right-wing extremists, the Boogaloo Boys, which is a far more dramatic indication than the FBI saying we have no intel that it's Antifa. Well, not only do you have no intel that it's Antifa, you actually indicted the right-wing groups for it. So it's lie upon lie upon lie. It's propaganda. It's disinformation put out by Bill Barr for his own nefarious, racist purposes.
There he is, Glenn Kirschner. Follow him now, right now on Twitter at Glenn Kirschner2. Also, of course, subscribe to his YouTube page where he is putting up great pieces. And I would, call them journalistic as well. He's got all the credibility, and now he's performing journalism on that YouTube page. And I learn a lot from it. So I'm psyched to have you whenever I do. Thank you for joining me, sir.
Thank you, Pete. Appreciate it.
All right, go say hello to Glenn right now on Twitter and tell him that you heard him on the Stand Up with Pete Dominick podcast at Glenn Kirschner, the number 2. Check him out and say hi to him. That always matters. I saw a lot of you do that yesterday with my guests, and I really appreciate that. Keeps them coming back. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for your paid subscriptions. If you haven't signed up yet, go to patreon.com/Pete Dominick or click the paid subscription link in the show notes for today's episode. A lot more great guests coming up this week, including Elie Mystal. I'm scheduled to talk with comedian Alonzo Bowden. I've got some other folks who you don't know that I'm really excited to introduce you to that listeners have suggested, and maybe you. I'd like to do an episode checking in with listeners, seeing how you're doing with work, with the pandemic, with the new civil rights movement of our time, and dealing with and trying to understand everything that's happening in the streets in America, much less with the Trump administration, and how you're dealing with the fact that people seemingly are forgotten that we are in the midst of a pandemic. Lots that I want to talk about with you. If you'd like to join me on the podcast, I'm going to definitely be reaching out to listeners later this week. Look forward to talking to you. Thanks for listening today. I'll talk to you tomorrow. Be the change you want to see in the world. Know that you're not alone and that I love you, and I am thinking of you. I am. Really. Talk tomorrow.